And without further ado, I want to welcome Mark Griffiths. So Mark is a practitioner actually and independent researcher with over 30 years experience. And he's gonna talk us about their experiences building dwellings with Neolithic technology, right? Mark, yes. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi. Yeah, yes, my name is Mark Griffiths. I'm a historic woodworker, and I'd like to start by saying thank you to the World Wood Day Foundation for not only this event for the past couple of days, but also the support they've given my project over the years, which has really helped us to investigate Neolithic and prehistory woodworking. I'd also like to thank Michael for inviting me to speak today. So as I say, I'm a historical woodworker, and I'm part of a group called the Palace Boy Project. We were formed about 4 or 5 years ago, and what we do, we investigate wooden artifacts that have been found in wetland archaeology. So the wood has been preserved through mineral deposits in peatland and the wetlands. And we have a process of starting by investigating, as you can see on one screen, looking at these pieces and taking measurements, looking at tool marks. And then from that, we have sets of tools made, whether they're Bronze Age, as you can see the gorgeous Bronze Age axe there, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Neolithic tools. The tools are made to match the tool marks that we're seeing on the original pieces. And then we have a process of making, but the way our process differs is we're not looking at so much at data, we're looking at more of the cultural significance of these items and how they relate to the human experience. So by doing this, we have a multidisciplinary process, and we invite poets, musicians, artists to really get involved in the process of making and to interact with the things that we have made, just to see how they respond to them as well. And from that, we sort of gain some sort of understanding of the human element of these objects and how they were interpreted in their times. This project relates to an invitation we had from Natural England, who is an organisation in the UK. And their ideas are about rewilding, taking back nature from industrial sites and opening them back up to the public and turning them into nature reserves. And this is a site in Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, and they found on one of their sites, it used to be for cutting peat for agricultural purposes, for burning and for fertilization. So it's a large peatworks on a massive scale in this landscape. And eventually the peatwork stopped, Natural England took over the site and they rewilded it. And during that process of rewilding, this ancient Neolithic corduroy trackway was discovered. It'd actually been damaged by the peat cutters years before. No one had realized there was a massive cut through the center of it. And Natural England invited us to come and recreate this trackway after the archaeological investigation had been done, to recreate it just to see how it fitted into the landscape, what it would have looked like intact in its original form. The landscape itself is absolutely stunning. It's gorgeous, and the work that they're doing is incredible to bring it back to this, what we can see now. The trackway, the original trackway, was found just over the distance, over the hill that you can see. So we brought ours forward, but it's a fantastic landscape, and it has all kinds of resources in it. And the weather can change quite dramatically as well, as you can see. So it's on the east coast of England in South Yorkshire. It's very flat, very boggy, very peaty, and this is why the wood in the trackway was preserved to the extent it was. The process we take as well, we ask volunteers to help us, which is quite an interesting process, because you you have people as well as like artists and different people with the volunteers. There's a real cross-section of society there. We have people that had diverse backgrounds, diverse abilities. Some people had disabilities, but for us, this really reflected the community itself, the community that would have made these objects in the past. So even though they are novice builders, they come to it with a sort of understanding, and we can, I don't like the word study them, but it's interesting to see how they react together and how they share work and how work is sectioned off between each member of this group. So the track is quite successful. It got quite a lot of interest from people coming to look at it from Natural England. So they wanted us to expand the project. And the way we did that was to create a roundhouse. We decided to build a roundhouse in the Neolithic style. There was no archaeological evidence on the site of a house, but we thought we'll look at ones in Northern Europe and some others that have been discovered in England and start the process ourselves. So we started by having like tools made. What we can see here are flint axe heads and flint knife as well. These tools worked remarkably well. They were very, very different to traditional axes and even the Bronze Age axes and the Iron Age axes that we'd had made. It's a very different process of working. It's almost like it chews or gnaws at the wood rather than cutting the wood. So it's very slow. We're cutting trees of about 15 centimeters in diameter with these axes. And the process took probably about 4 times longer than it would do with a contemporary axe. But the results were really interesting. And it looked almost as though it had been chewed by beaver. And sometimes we found in archaeology that sites where they think there may be Neolithic and flint worked timber, it turns out to be actually beavers building dams, and they've been left sunk in the earth, and they look exactly the same as a flint worked piece of wood. So there's 2 different types of axes here. You can see a napped flint axe, which is more like a wobbled axe. It's got chips taking out of it, which give it a cutting edge. And then on in the foreground in the center is a polished stone axe, which takes a long time to do. It's a very, very skilled process. And you basically work the stone until you end up with a sharp edge on it. The only problem with these axes are if they chip, then that stone has to be repolished again. Whereas the flint axes, when they chip, they automatically create another sharp edge. And the other fascinating thing about flint axe is if you find an axe head that has been buried for thousands of years, it's still sharp. And if our reproduction ones, if you found one of these, there's virtually no way of telling whether it was a traditional Neolithic axe from the period or something that had been remade. So we have to be very careful when we're making these axes that all the debris is properly disposed of in a way that it can't confuse people who are on the site doing investigations in the future. But they were interesting to use. It was a very slow process, but it's quite a lovely process as well. And it's really nice learning a new technique in woodworking. So, and our volunteers got on really well with them, surprisingly well. And for the trackway itself, we had to fell about 250 trees using these axes. So it was a very labor-intensive process, but you just have to fall into a mindset of work and just allow the tool to do the job. Because otherwise, if you force it, then it will get damaged and you get exhausted yourself. So the landscape itself, when we approached the landscape, it had an abundance of materials that we would need to build the house, and we thought, fantastic, we have everything we need here. The idea of the project was to imagine ourselves as Neolithic settlers moving into this landscape for the first time, and then using the resources available to build our house. Also, we'd be working seasonally as well, because it was a nature reserve, so we had to work with the nesting seasons of birds, and there's lots of adders, lots of snakes on the site. But also we wanted to experiment with felling trees when the sap was low, and the natural growing seasons of the timber and the other materials we used. So we were looking at using Scots pine, birch, predominantly for building the house, and then willow, which we can see in the centre, for doing the weaving, the wattle and door walls. The walls would be covered with the clay that we were finding in the lakes, and a mixture of clay, mud, and horse hair and hay. And then what you can see me holding there are reeds as well that we were harvesting from the reed beds to reed the roof, and also to add into the clay mixture and to cover the flooring inside the house. So one of our unseen problems, well, there are many unseen problems with building this, and this is why this kind of work is so fascinating, was the collection of materials itself. So for instance, with the timber, we had to go quite far and wide to find the right sort of timbers we wanted, even though the place was covered in birch forest. To find straight timbers at the right size that haven't been distorted during the growth cycle was quite challenging. And then to go into a heavy, dense woodland to cut the trees down using traditional tools, and then to bring them out of that, to sned them, to take all the branches off, and to transport them away and transfer them back onto our site was actually really, really time consuming and quite exhausting as well for our volunteers. So that was the problem with the timber. Also, the vast quantities needed, the vast quantities of willow that we needed for the weaving. And then the clay itself was really heavy, obviously, and to transport that and the quantities needed from the riverbed to where we were working was near impossible. We tried different methods of this, dragging and making like animal hide skins and pulling it along. But to get the quantities we needed, it's really hard, very hard to mix as well. I don't know if you noticed in the last picture, there was actually a modern mixer that we ended up using to mix the quantities we needed. And also the reed for the roof was, we started harvesting and soon became aware of the quantities we'd need to cover the roof were absolutely vast, and no way with the reed that we were harvesting, we wouldn't be able to harvest the amounts that we had in the timescale that we had. And also the reed's quality was poor. It was very dry, it was very brittle, it's very thin. We tried several different methods of soaking and trying different areas, different locations, but really the reed was just really wasn't the quality that we needed it to be. So unfortunately, we ended up having to bring things in. So we brought in clay, and we brought in reed as well that had to be transported, which sort of failed the whole point of our process, but also it spoke to us about how challenging these things are and how difficult it is to do this. So it led me to this idea of the Neolithic survey, or Neolithic surveyor. We have this concept that you walk into a landscape, and people from the past walk into a landscape, see certain elements that worked for them, whether that was fish and rivers, whether that was shelter, whether that was somewhere to have animals. But there's so many different elements as well, and the materials in the landscape to build with have to be correct. So the clay that we were finding had tiny little shards of stoning, which would have cut, well, it was cutting our hands as we were working it. As I say, the quantities of timber to get them close to where we wanted to be. And that was in a very different location to where the reeds were, and the reeds weren't of quality. So we experimented with different materials as well to see if we can compensate with what we had. But there was an element where if we had moved into this landscape to build this house using what was there, I think the house would have failed. I don't think we could have built a shelter to really function in the way we wanted it to function with the materials that we had in this landscape, which was a real surprise to us. We were expecting just to be able to go ahead, build, and it would have been amazing just to have this small footprint, but it was apparent that wasn't the way. So this idea that people in the past would walk into a landscape and be able to read it, be able to understand, be able to look at the clay, look at the timber, look at the reeds, all these elements, and know instinctively whether these would work in their environment or not and work for their build, became really apparent to us, and something we hadn't expected at all. So the other thing we found out was, so these projects aren't as simple as you first see or first suppose them to be, but there's other elements that come to light, and this is where our project is quite keen on the human element of these things. And what's really spoke to us at the end of this project was how our volunteers, and I don't like the word volunteer because they were so much more than that. Let's call them new Neolithic builders, but how they bonded, how they came together, and how they overcame their abilities, their knowledge, how they learnt, how they worked, and the friendships and the community that was bonded by this project. And it soon became apparent to us that building builds communities. These objects are things that bring people together. And I've been using the term house, Neolithic house, a lot. It's a modern conception that a house is a house, the way we see it. But also, there's no clear evidence for domestic dwelling in Neolithic houses. They could have been used for so many different purposes. So we're calling it a house, but it's more of a community area, being used as a community area. So as well as building something for the community, you're making a community with these type of projects. And we find this
Mark,
time and time again.
you have 2 minutes left. You need to conclude because you have 2 minutes left, please.
Sorry, yeah. So basically we found that with the project that, and everything that we've done is all about basically the human element and how people react with these objects. It's more about the building than the actual object itself. That's what I like to find. So, so thank you ever so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a very interesting project. I was very happy reading your abstract and very curious. And I already have a question for you. I will be quick not to go over time. It came via WhatsApp because they couldn't post it on the chat. So Oriol López Bultó from Autonomous University of Barcelona says, congratulations on your work. Could you tell on which archaeological evidence did you base your reconstructions in terms of taxa selection, morphology of the trunks, morphology of the construction? Thank you. Please be quick.
Yeah, so the trackway, we actually had the archaeologists who did the initial excavation on the original trackway. They worked with us on our reconstruction, so which is great. So we had all their data to work to and their first-hand knowledge of it as well. With the house itself, it was a composite of different ideas, and basically we were looking more at the landscape than any data from a discovered house. So it's just looking at what had been made before and what we could make. So
yeah, I see. All right. So yeah, maybe it was oversized, or I don't know if you would have done it differently. Or well, I actually had a question. I will just put it there for a thought. But you said that you worked or you harvested the materials during the winter season, I understand, or when the sap was low. So I was wondering maybe if it would have been easier during the growing season when the sap is flowing, and maybe the rye when it was fresh instead of dry. I just leave it there, and maybe if someone is curious, they can contact you per email. And because we need to move on to the next speaker. But thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.